Today is Monday, 16th September, and I find myself starting the day with the news of another assassination attempt against the Republican nominee for the presidency in the election in November, Donald Trump. Well, the details that have been pouring in over the last few hours speak of an assassination attempt on a golf course, one which I understand is owned by Trump himself in Florida. The alleged shooter, and of course he hasn't yet been convicted of anything, but anyway, the alleged shooter apparently infiltrated himself onto the grounds of this golf course. He appears to have hidden himself in some bushes. He apparently had a rifle with him, to be precise, a Kalashnikov AK-47 assault rifle. Not perhaps the obvious sort of rifle one would expect a sniper to use. Just saying, suggests somebody who doesn't perhaps know a huge amount about firearms. Not that I do, by the way, just to add. Others can perhaps take this up, but I've heard many people say that Kalashnikovs, at least early era Kalashnikovs, are not the most accurate weapons. Anyway, put that aside. Anyway, he was apparently there with a Kalashnikov rifle, various other kit, and interestingly a camera with which apparently he intended to film the assassination. And then we got more information about him over the course of the day. He was apparently spotted by a Secret Service officer who was moving along the golf course 300 to 500 meters ahead of Trump. So Trump was a couple of hundred meters away from the incident. Anyway, this Secret Service officer clearly was doing his job well. He spotted this person in the bushes. He noticed that this person was armed. An exchange of fire took place. The individual in question, the would-be assassin, apparently fled. He had access to a car, an SUV, in fact. He tried to drive away. Somebody, however, managed to take a photograph showing the driving plate with the number, and the car was stopped, and the individual in question was arrested. And the media has been full of information about him, and we learned that he was a committed supporter of Ukraine, that he has been to Ukraine several times, that he has boasted of his efforts to try to get Americans to enlist and fight in Ukraine. He is not apparently somebody with any military background whatsoever, and I've read accounts in both the American and British media that the Ukrainians didn't take him particularly seriously, and that his efforts at recruiting people in the United States didn't really amount to very much. But the fact remains that he was interviewed quite extensively by the media at one time. There's a film which is circulating of him being interviewed by, I believe it was Newsweek, and certainly he's been interviewed by other heavyweight media operations, including, I understand, and this slightly surprised me, the Financial Times, though I haven't seen that interview myself. Anyway, he attracted a sufficient amount of attention in order to do that. Now, this individual has not given his explanations of why he attempted to carry out the assassination, assuming that he did, which I'm going to assume for the rest of the program. By the way, because he hasn't so far, as I know, been charged and convicted of anything, that is why I avoid using his name. Just saying. But you can find it all over the internet if you wish. But anyway, he hasn't been named. He has been named, but anyway, he hasn't, or at least we haven't heard of any explanation that he's going to provide. But apparently his social media operations are full of talk about Ukraine, and one must assume that he was acting out of concern. I'm choosing my words very carefully. Concern that if elected, President Trump would take action that would ultimately result in a cut-off of US support for Ukraine, something which everyone agrees, were it to happen, would result in Ukraine's eventual collapse. So that presumably is the most likely reason why this individual acted, and until we hear otherwise, it's the reason I'm going to go with. It seems to me the obvious one. I ought to say that based on the media reports I have seen so far, and these are only early reports, it doesn't seem at all likely, and in fact, I don't believe that this individual was involved in any larger plot, and I don't believe that the Ukrainian authorities had any part in this event. I think that they would understand that being involved in something like this would be completely counterproductive, and, well, I all but exclude that possibility. I would add that shortly before doing this program, I understand that President Zelensky of Ukraine condemned this intended assassination. And by the way, President Zelensky has previously confirmed that he is indeed traveling to the United States, that he expects to meet President Biden and Vice President Harris, but that he also expects or wants to meet with Donald Trump. And this was before this incident took place. Anyway, that is the sum total of the information that I have about this affair up to this point. I do think, however, that some preliminary conclusions can be reached, and I find them most concerning. The first is that this is the second attempted assassination of Donald Trump, which has taken place over the course of this election. And in fact, the previous attack took place as recently as June, and now we have another. And I have to say that that does not, I am afraid, surprise me. The rhetoric, the language that is used about Donald Trump, I find absolutely extraordinary. I am not going to cite any particular article. I'm not going to cite any particular commentary that anyone has written or spoken about Donald Trump. I don't want to give the impression that I'm implicating any particular individual or article in this event, or that I'm implying that any particular article or comment incited or inspired this individual to do what they did. There is no information to say that, and I don't want to do that. But about the general climate of commentary and talk about Donald Trump, well, I have to say, I have never known anything like it in all the time that I have been following politics, including American politics. I can remember long ago when lots of people were saying extremely rude and aggressive things about Richard Nixon, both before and after he was elected president of the United States. All sorts of very, very extraordinary things were said about him. Very critical things were said about him. But none that came anywhere close, in my opinion, to some of the things that people say about Donald Trump. And I have to say this, and I want to repeat the point, I made it before. that when rhetoric like this about someone becomes as commonplace as this rhetoric has been, then there are all sorts of troubled and unhappy people who have a way of picking up this rhetoric. They may feel that they're not getting the attention that they deserve. This individual got an awful lot of attention a short time ago when he was being interviewed a lot by the media, but as far as I can see, all that attention went away, and he might, I don't want to speculate too far, have felt somehow that where he'd been in the spotlight before, it was unsatisfactory for him, that he was no longer in the spotlight to the same extent again. And it might be, and it's always the case, that when people of that nature hear all of these things and commentaries and words said about someone or some group of persons, they come together and they say to themselves, well, let's take the act, do the thing. If we succeed, we will place our names in history. Everyone will be talking about us, and we will also have rid humanity, the world, the United States, the Republic, of somebody who was wicked and dangerous and needed to be removed from the scene. And I'm afraid there are people like that. And I say again, point that I made at the time of the first assassination, that as part of my work long ago, I used to have to interview all kinds of people, including people of that kind. And I remember noticing the ease with which they picked up ideas of that nature that were circulating and how that threatened to shape their actions. Now, after the first assassination, there was some talk that the language would die down, that people would be more circumspect and careful about what they said. And that was true for about a day, and then it all resumed again as if the assassination attempt had never happened. And all the same rhetoric that I've been hearing about Donald Trump for years, and which preceded the first assassination attempt, came back and has continued at the same level of intensity. Well, I very much hope that this time, after this second assassination attempt, that will change. I say that, I doubt that it will be so, but there we are. And beyond that, there is something else, which is that there's been much discussion, a huge amount of comment about the many security failures that took place over the course of the first assassination attempt. The fact that the shooter got as close to Donald Trump as he did, the fact that it was only the fact that Donald Trump moved his head at one point that caused the first bullet to miss, the fact that the entire security system around Donald Trump on that day basically seemed to be dysfunctional, and following inquiries by Congress, I don't think that is disputed anymore. And of course, the head of the Secret Service subsequently had to resign. Well, with this second assassination attempt, it seems that things were better in the sense that, on this occasion at least, the Secret Service agent did see the shooter in the bushes and did take immediate action, and that might have saved Donald Trump's life. So one can't say that the system completely failed. But I have to say this, again, over the last couple of hours, I've been reading reports that because he's not president of the United States, Donald Trump is not getting the same level of security that the actual president receives and that he would receive in the event that he was elected. Now, that makes absolutely no sense to me. That seems to me a bureaucratic response to this problem that we see with Donald Trump's security. Because, to say it straightforwardly, there are far more threats to Donald Trump. There's far more danger to Donald Trump than there is, so far as I can tell, to any other political figure of roughly comparable position in America. I cannot see the same compelling reason for an assassin to want to come after anyone else as they would want to come after Donald Trump at this particular time. I say that given, of course, the context of the rhetoric about him, and in this case, the probable fears of this individual about a shift of policy over Ukraine that I've spoken about earlier in this program. So, given that Donald Trump is obviously at risk, serious risk, that such an attempt would be made, I would have thought that the Secret Service would be pulling out all the stops, doing everything necessary to ensure his complete security, and would be providing him with security, at least comparable to that of the President of the United States. Hiding behind protocol, saying he can't be given exactly the same level of security as the President himself is, I think simply doesn't address the very real security threats that exist at the moment. And I find it incredible, and I have to say this, that the Secret Service is not responding to this situation in the way that I have said. Anyway, this is all I think I can say about this assassination attempt. It fills me with concern and foreboding. I should say that a successful assassination of any individual who is running for high office in the United States during this election period would be a disaster. But if it is the assassination of the candidate of one of the two leading parties, well, that disaster would be compounded. And given all that has happened in the last 9 years, if it is Donald Trump, then the disaster would be, I fear, even greater still. I hope that this time the lessons will be learnt, that the security around Donald Trump will be brought finally to the proper level. I hope also that people in the media, in politics, elsewhere, will finally understand that the kind of rhetoric that has been taking place in the United States for several years now comes with risks, and that this will finally stop, and that we will have from this point onwards an orderly, safe election. To repeat a point I've made on a program about this event on the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, I cannot remember a presidential election in which a leading candidate has had to experience two attempts to assassinate him, one so shortly after the other. Maybe at some point in American history, though I am fairly familiar with American history, going all the way back to the foundation of the Republic. Maybe, however, in some previous election in the 19th century or elsewhere, something like this happened before. But I cannot recall it. I cannot recall a situation where a candidate has had to survive two assassination attempts over the course of the same electoral cycle. That is already a deeply alarming fact that we are in that position now. And I absolutely do not want to hear that there has been a third. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about this event. I hope that, as I said, we will not be faced with this situation a third time, or more times even than that. I think that unless things change, sadly, we run the risk that we will. Anyway, let's go back now to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And the most interesting thing to have happened, in my opinion, over the last 24 hours is that President Zelensky has given a chaotic and very difficult to understand interview in which, amongst other things, he's discussed the Kursk operation and his peace plan. And my overall sense, my very strong feeling, is that he understands, or has come as close to understanding as he probably ever will now, that he is losing the war in Ukraine, that the war in Ukraine is now being lost. Now, of course, he didn't say that exactly, but I would challenge anybody to follow this interview, which Zelensky has just given, and come to any different interpretation. He didn't discuss the success of the Kursk operation. He did say that it had been intended to divert Russian troops from Donbass, but he didn't really say whether that had happened. He lamented the shortage of men and machines that Ukraine has. He said that it has been impossible to equip properly all the 14 new brigades that Ukraine is supposedly forming. He blamed the lack of Western arms deliveries for that, which is probably true. But then, why does he believe that the West can continue to arm him and Ukraine at the level that he insists on? One of the frustrating things about this conflict is that so many people, including, of course, Zelensky himself, don't seem to be willing to acknowledge the limits, the physical limits on supplies which actually exist. Now, the best person, in my opinion, who's discussed these limits is Brian Beletic at the New Atlas. He discussed this whole topic a couple of days ago in another program that he did on the New Atlas. I think it was about a week ago, actually, in which he said that finally some people in the West, in the Netherlands, for example, over Patriot missile systems, are starting to admit that there simply aren't that many weapons that Ukraine can be provided with that will enable Ukraine to prevail in the war. But Zelensky himself, and by the way, many of his supporters in the West, simply refuse to acknowledge this truth. It is deeply frustrating. As I said, it's not as if the facts that Brian Beletic has so skillfully set out in program after program, going back right to the start of this war, it's not so difficult to establish all the various facts, he says. It's incredible to me that this is something that people shut their eyes and close their ears to and have done for so long. But it does seem to me that we are now close, finally, to the bottom of the barrel. And Zelensky knows it, and he's been complaining. He was complaining volubly about this in his interview. And then, of course, he also talked about his great victory plan, which we've heard so much about. And he was asked to explain what the victory plan was, and it all seemed to me a mishmash of various things. Talked about geopolitical alignments, security guarantees, things of that. In other words, things that can only happen as part of a peace proposal that ends the war. It's not part of any sort of military plan. The only aspect of it that seemed to me to speak of an actual military plan was where he discussed the need to give Ukraine every single weapon that it needed in order to prevail, to support Ukraine militarily as strongly or more strongly than ever. And as I understand it, the only part of his plan which is in any way original and which touches on military matters, the original is a bit of a stretch, actually. Anyway, the only part of his plan which could be described as being original is his proposal for deep strikes with Western missiles against Russia. Now, on that topic, I've done several programs recently, but I would like to acknowledge my debt to two individuals, both of whom have written to me clarifying a certain point. Now, yesterday I discussed an article in the London Times which spoke about the fact that in order to operate Storm Shadow missiles against Russia, because of the strength of Russia's electronic warfare systems, the GPS signals would be jammed, and that meant that the Storm Shadow missiles could only be used after data from satellites had been updated into ground mapping software that the missile carries. And I said over the course of the program that looked to me very much like the point that President Putin of Russia has made, that Ukraine cannot operate these missiles itself, that it would require NATO personnel to do that because the data has to be provided by NATO satellites or satellites of NATO states, and the data can only be uploaded by NATO technicians. That was what Putin said, and Putin said that if that happened, then those technicians would be involved directly in conducting strikes against Russia, and that would be in effect an act of war, and that the Russians would have to respond accordingly. So it seemed to me that what the Times article was saying appeared to confirm or corroborate what Putin had previously said. But I said that I did not know and did not fully understand whether what the Times was saying was that because the software in question is American and that the Americans have proprietary rights to it, that this would need the active involvement of specifically American technicians to upload the satellite data into the ground mapping program. I hope I've explained this all clearly. As you will understand, this isn't really my thing at all. As I've said many times, I'm not a technical person in any shape or form. Anyway, the two people who have contacted me, one of whom is a former Air Force officer, but I don't want to say anything more about him than that. Anyway, these two people have both come along and have provided me with a great deal of information. And in summary, and this is my extrapolation from the information that they have provided, I believe, this is my own belief now, that indeed it could only be done, the uploading of the satellite data, which, by the way, I understand is data that only American satellites have the level of definition in terms of the pictures they take to produce, that this data from, in other words, American satellites can in fact only be uploaded practically by hand by specifically American technicians. So that's Zelensky's peace victory plan. It is to get, as I understand it, American technicians to participate alongside the Ukrainians and the British in deep strikes against Russia on Russian territory. That which President Putin of Russia has said the Russians would treat as an act of war. Now that is reckless, irresponsible, extraordinary to the most extreme level. I've already talked about it many times in my programs. I don't want to repeat this again. It goes directly contrary to the red line that the Americans themselves have repeatedly imposed on themselves. They have said that no way can American troops, be involved in direct strikes against Russia or in combat against the Russians. Were they involved in that, as President Biden himself said at the beginning of the conflict back in February 2022, it would be World War III. And unsurprisingly, there are many people in the United States, Jake Sullivan, according to the London Times, the Pentagon, as I think is all too obvious, who have put their foot down and said this must not happen. So for the moment at least, this idea of deep missile strikes against Russia, an essential part of Zelensky's plan, victory plan, appears to be, at least for the moment, off the table. I say at least for the moment. Apparently, Prime Minister Starmer of Britain is continuing to lobby, this time with the European powers, Italy, Germany and France, for their support, their backing, whilst he tries to put this plan into effect, tries to get the Americans to change their minds about it. I predict, by the way, that he will come up against a wall of refusal in Italy and Germany. Both governments of both of these countries have flatly rejected this idea. In France, I think President Macron might be sympathetic. He's previously floated equally dangerous ideas, like sending French troops to Ukraine, just saying. But he's now a significantly diminished figure. I think his new Prime Minister, or at least the man he's nominated to be Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, is far less likely to be attracted to an idea of this kind. And of course, there is a majority in the French Parliament, the National Assembly, that would strongly oppose this idea. So I think the French are likely to say no as well. And it's important to remember that the Storm Shadow is ultimately a French-derived and French-produced missile. So anyway, nonetheless, as I said, it remains Zelensky's plan. And as far as I can tell, it is the only military part of his plan which actually exists. And it's unsurprising that this is so, because with every day that passes, the conflict becomes more lopsided. I noticed that Zelensky now says that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in artillery shells by a factor of 12 to 1. Other times, other Ukrainians have put it at less, 2.5 to 1. I saw recently 5 to 1 seems to be more common, but Zelensky says it's 12 to 1. And there's no doubt at all that the Russians massively outnumber the Ukrainians in every area of combat. And Zelensky said that the Russians are now dropping 4,000 glided bombs on Ukraine every month. And I believe this is probably about correct. And the result is that we are now looking at a Russian air campaign over Ukraine, which is now finally comparable to the sort of air campaigns that the United States and the NATO powers conduct over the course of their own wars. So, there is no victory plan. There cannot be a victory plan. The only victory plan that President Zelensky can come up with, even if it's not one that he wants to own up to, is a plan for the United States to join the war itself and to fight the Russians, to do, in other words, that which President Biden warned all those years ago would mean World War III. And to my mind, that is not a plan for victory. That is a plan for potentially ultimate disaster. Anyway, that's President Zelensky's latest set of ideas. He's apparently going to come to the United States. As I said, he's going to discuss all of this with President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Donald Trump. We'll see whether they change their views about anything that has previously been said. So, there we are. That is Zelensky's peace plan. As I said, it looks to me the most pessimistic interview that Zelensky has given at any point over the course of this war up to now. Now, over and above what Zelensky himself said about his victory plan, there have been comments and rumours circulating as well. And there was an article about the victory plan in the German newspaper BILD-Zeitung, a newspaper which, as I have said, enthusiastically backs Ukraine, but which is very well informed about many of the things that are taking place in the war. Julian Röpke, its correspondent on the ground in Ukraine, is one of the most interesting and well-informed reporters about the war, certainly on the Western side that I know about. And I say that despite the fact that obviously he and I would disagree completely about most things about the war, including its causes, its origins, and presumably its eventual outcome also. But he's become increasingly pessimistic, and I have to say his reports always appear to me, at least I tend to find them, as striving for genuine accuracy or factual accuracy. Anyway, BILD-Zeitung spoke about Zelensky's victory plan, and they said that it involved missile strikes on positions deep inside Russia. Well, we know all about that, but apparently it was open to the idea of local ceasefires in various places along the battle fronts. Now, this is, in my opinion, actually absurd. Why would the Russians agree to local ceasefires when Ukraine is losing the war and the only result of such ceasefires would be to prolong the war and delay the Russian victory. I mean, at a purely military level, it makes no sense. And of course, President Putin, who has spoken about how ceasefires in the past have been misused by the Ukrainians to their own advantage. Anyway, he has previously said, he said during his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry back in June, that the Russians are prepared to sit down and talk to Ukraine and negotiate with them, but they're not prepared to consider a ceasefire unless and until the Ukrainians withdraw all their forces from the four regions, from Donbass, from Zaporozhye, and from Kherson, including the city of Kherson and the surrounding territory located on the West Bank, the Ukrainian-controlled West Bank of the Dnieper. So on the face of it, if this peace plan, so-called peace plan, or victory plan, so-called victory plan, includes provisions for local ceasefires, then I think these are a non-starter. The Russians will not agree to them. But the moment BITCHUTE came up with its article, the Ukrainians started to have hissy fits. So Zelensky's spokesperson, and one of his top advisors came out and said that the whole BITCHUTE article was untrue, that there was no thought or suggestion or idea in any part of this victory plan for local ceasefires. This was not even a worthy subject of discussion. And shortly after, inevitably perhaps, a hardline Ukrainian activist who goes by the name of Magwar, he is apparently actually ethnic Ukrainian, came out and said that if there was any kind of proposal which involved substantive concessions to the Russians, including territorial concessions, the Ukrainian nationalist brigades would immediately respond and march on Kiev. It was again a clear warning and threat of a coup. So the victory plan apparently does not include proposals for ceasefires. Perhaps it originally did, but no longer does after all this response and after the revelations from BITCHUTE. And perhaps in response to those comments by these hardline nationalists, Ukrainian officials have again, including a top advisor of Zelensky's, have come forward and have again said that the only framework under which Ukraine is prepared to enter into discussions with the Russians is the framework set by Zelensky's so-called peace plan. One should distinguish between his victory plan, which is a new construct or concept, and his victory plan, with which the Ukrainians formulated in the autumn of 2022, and which basically says that in order for there to be peace, Putin must step down, the Russians must withdraw from all the territory that they've occupied since 2014, including Crimea, and then negotiations can take place on such topics as war crimes trials for Russian officials and leaders, and reparation payments by Russia to Ukraine, and such things. And as I've discussed many times and in many places, that is not a peace plan. That is a demand for Russia's effective capitulation, and the Russians are not going to agree. Certainly, they're not going to agree now when they are winning the war. But it seems that the political situation in Kiev makes it impossible for the Ukrainians to move from this position. So there we are. The Bild Zeitung article, which might have been intended, and for all I know was intended, might have been instigated by some people within the German government to perhaps try to get the Ukrainians to start thinking about ceasefires and armistices and that kind of thing. All that it has done is that it has resulted in further declarations from the Ukrainians reaffirming their original hardline, ultra tough position. So there we are. That's where we are on the diplomatic front. We are stuck. We remain nowhere at all. The US administration, instead of thinking about these matters, thinking about a proper way out of the war, is left debating this disastrous idea of long-range missile strikes on Russia, hiding, with some wanting to hide behind the British and pretend that it's the British who will be doing them with the Ukrainians, whereas Putin and the various people who have been contacting me appear to think that this can't be done without the direct involvement of the United States. Others in the United States, Jake Sullivan, the Pentagon, strongly opposed to this idea, as they should be, but unable, it seems, to win the argument and bury this idea once and for all. The European powers, structurally incapable of agreeing a policy for Ukrainian peace, because to do so might open Western political leaders like Olaf Scholz and Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron and others to questions about why they haven't sought peace in Ukraine previously, why in fact they allowed the situation to evolve to the point where a war actually happened. Anyway, the Europeans also seem incapable of coming up with any plan for peace. And anyway, one way or the other, we seem stuck. The Russians, as I've said, do not seem to be keen on opening negotiations with the Ukrainians at this time. They are winning, and winning decisively on the battlefronts. And for them to begin negotiations now, before their victory has been achieved, would be premature and would simply mean accepting a weaker position instead of a stronger one. Anyway, that now brings me to the situation on the battlefronts. And, well, without going into too much detail, Group of Forces North is claiming that over the last few hours, they've advanced a further 4.5 kilometers in Kursk region. Again, it's very unclear where these advances have taken place, but there is now conclusive evidence that the Russians have obtained full control of the village of Borki, which is located to the southeast of Suja. And there are further reports that the Russians are now pushing towards the next village to the east, which is Plekhovo, which lies directly on the border between Ukraine and Russia. And there's no confirmation yet about the situation in Lyubimovka, but the Russians appear to have captured various villages around Lyubimovka, and the Ukrainians might be making a big defense of Lyubimovka, but my own view is that within a relatively short period of time, the Russians will have captured this village as well, this important village as well. So, as I've discussed in several programs, the Ukrainian enclave in Kursk region is shrinking. And this, at the same time, as Ukrainian soldiers have themselves been saying, that the situation for them in Kursk region is becoming more difficult. There are more Russian soldiers there. The Russians have transferred artillery assets there. The drones, Russian drones, are now filling the skies over Kursk. It is becoming increasingly dangerous for the Ukrainians to use the roads in Kursk region because of the ubiquitous presence of the Russian drones. And of course, according to Radovka, in 2 or 3 weeks' time, the rains will start, the ground will turn soft, the Ukrainians will probably be obliged to use the roads, even as these become increasingly dangerous. And they're also having problems with communications because GPS doesn't work. Other radio signals are being jammed, and Starlink in Kursk region is spotty. So, a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians in Kursk. I think the Russians will wait until the rains before they choose to carry out the knockout blow. I suspect that in this area, they will want to trap and surround as many Ukrainian troops as they can, inflicting as humiliating a defeat on the Ukrainians as it is possible. And they will do so precisely because obviously it plays into the attrition side of their strategy, but also because pictures of large numbers of Ukrainian prisoners, which would become possible once Ukrainian troops in various scattered communities across this enclave start to be cut off from each other because of the autumn rains. Large numbers of prisoners at this point of the war would suit very much Russian, to say it bluntly, propaganda purposes. Anyway, there we go. Now, the Ukrainians have been conducting their own attempted offensive in Glushkovo area, rather to the west. There's much discussion about its purpose, whether it's intended to slow the Russians down in their offensive in Kursk region, or whether, on the contrary, its purpose is to achieve some kind of breakthrough in Glushkovo, in the Glushkovo area of Kursk, south of the Sime River, which the Ukrainians have been planning all along. I'm confident myself that it is indeed intended to counter the Russian advance in Kursk region. But regardless, one way or the other, it doesn't seem as if this offensive, this Ukrainian offensive towards Glushkovo, is very successful at the moment. The Russians are too strong and too numerous. They appear to have sorted out their problems with their logistics supplies. It looks as if the Ukrainians have so far not been able to capture the village of Visola, which was apparently their initial objective. And anyway, one way or the other, this operation is not perhaps stuck, but it's not making the progress that the Ukrainians thought it would. They're just losing more men and more valuable and hard to replace machines conducting this offensive in the Glushkovo area, and they're not achieving any particular gains in the process. So it seems to me that the entire situation in Kursk has now been reversed. The hunters have become the hunted. The Russians have gradually turned the whole situation to their advantage. Various military people that I've spoken to, Daniel Davis, Jim Webb, others, seem to think that there might be something in the suggestion that was made to me by my source, that it was all a Russian trap and that that was what it was all along. Well, whether the Russians intentionally laid a trap or whether the Ukrainians created a trap for themselves, it hardly matters, because a trap is what the Kursk offensive has turned out to be. And to repeat, if this Kursk offensive is defeated, if the Ukrainians are pushed across the border, if they suffer heavy losses and large numbers of Ukrainian troops are killed, or worse still, from a propaganda angle, captured, then after all the hype that we saw in August, this will be a very depressing moment for Ukraine. It will cause morale to fall, to sink even further. Now, elsewhere on the battlefronts, the situation continues to move against Ukraine. Now, this morning, I was reading reports in a Russian Telegram channel that I tend to find reliable, that the Russians have captured the 2 coal mines in the Vuhledar area, South Donbass number 1, which is located close to Vuhledar itself, and South Donbass number 3. Apparently, and in fact, film of this exists, the Russians had to destroy a large building in the coal mine South Donbass number 3 because of the large number of mines and booby traps that the Ukrainians had placed inside that building. And there are dramatic pictures of the Russian demolition technicians destroying this building. It's a sort of tower-like structure, and you see it all collapse on itself in the most dramatic possible way. And anyway, the Ukrainians appear to be admitting that South Donbass number 3 has indeed been captured by the Russians. They still claim that there are still some of their men fighting in the coal mine closer to Vuhledar, which is South Donbass number 1. And maybe they still control the slag heap of that particular coal mine. Though I think it is likely that the Russians will clear South Donbass number 1 as well as South Donbass number 3 very soon. Anyway, possibly in light of the capture of South Donbass number 3, coal mine South Donbass number 3, the Russians are now saying that they have fire control over the last remaining supply road to Vuhledar, the smaller road, the one that goes south from the village of Bogoyavlenka. And there's a report about this today from the Russian TASS news agency. As I've said many times, this is Russia's official news agency. So it says the following: access to last supply route actually cut for Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar. The Ukrainians have been struggling to travel along dirt roads as all of them are under the fire control of Russian forces. And the report then goes on to say the Ukrainian battle group in Vuhledar in the Donetsk People's Republic has been almost completely cut off from supply routes now that the last remaining motor road has actually come under Russian fire control. A Russian law enforcement officer told TASS. And TASS elsewhere says that the officer in question came from the Russian police, which is interesting. Anyway, the officer is then reported as saying the last route which the enemy battle group in Vuhledar used for supplies has actually been cut off. Now it is completely under Russian fire control. Ukrainian troops have been struggling to travel along dirt roads, as all of them are also under the fire control of Russian forces. Now, if the Russians are indeed in control of South Donbass number 3, then it's easy to see why they would be in fire control of the last supply road, the last motor road. And obviously there are probably country roads, dirt roads in this area. There always are. But these are obviously not a substitute for a proper paved motor road. And of course, we are now in the second half of September. In perhaps 2 weeks' time, the autumn rains will begin. The Rasputitsa will start. This is southern. This is the south. This is southern Donbass. This is open steppe land. This is exactly the kind of territory where we're going to start to see mud conditions, and motor vehicles will almost certainly find it extremely difficult to move along these country roads. By contrast, the Russians control the motor roads. So I'm going to make a guess, it's a difficult guess, that if the Ukrainians are still fighting in Vuhledar in 2 or 3 weeks' time, they will be completely cut off from resupply. They will be in a critical position. Their supplies will be running low. The prospects for a retreat will have gone. Their condition will be, well, not grave, it will be catastrophic. The last days for a retreat from Vuhledar to Bogoyavlenka and further north to Kurachovo itself, the last days are now. Already, with the motor roads cut by the Russians, and that's what we see, the road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar was cut some weeks ago. Now the next supply road, the supply road from Bogoyavlenka to Vuhledar, has also been cut. With the supply roads cut, it's already going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to pull back from Vuhledar. They will have to move along the country roads. They will be exposed to drone and artillery attack by the Russians. The Russians will anyway be also presumably in hot pursuit. It's debatable how much of the garrison in Vuhledar would survive such a withdrawal. But if they wait much longer, if they wait until the rains begin, then the option of a retreat disappears entirely, and, well, they will then face the grim choice of fight on till the very end in conditions when medical supplies and all other supplies are dwindling, or to surrender to the Russians. And I hope if it does come to that choice, it is the second that they will do. Anyway, that's the situation, it seems to me, in Vuhledar. Now, elsewhere, we've received less news about whether the Russians are pushing south from Zelensky Persha to Zelensky Druhe, but we are told that the Ukrainians have now effectively confirmed that the Russians control all of the metropolitan area, the residential area of Ukrainsk. The only area that is still controlled by the Ukrainians in Ukrainsk is the area of the coal mine and the slag heap, and the Ukrainian troops there have been surrounded, And so far, it seems, there's been no success by the Ukrainians in breaking through in this area. They are effectively trapped, and it's likely that they will remain trapped. Ukrainian commentators are also saying that the Russians are now also advancing further south through the town of Girnik. This is another small town to the south of Ukrainsk, and that the situation in Girnik also is now very bad. So Pokrovsk situation, the Selidovo-Pokrovsk situation continues also to deteriorate. There was some claims, which I never believed, that the Ukrainians had recaptured the village of Kryty Yar, north of Novogrodovka. I didn't think these claims had any real support to them. The Ukrainians have now released film which appears to show Russian troops in secure control of the village of Kryty Yar, north of Novogrodovka. It's not clear whether the Russians also control the other two villages, Krasny Yar and Nikolaevka, that are located to the north of Kryty Yar, closer to Mirnograd. My guess is that they do. They do seem to control Grodivka, but I accept that Ukrainian troops sometimes engage in counter battles in that particular area. Redovka, in his report yesterday, continued to speak of the Russians as advancing in the villages of Suhye Yar and Lysivka, which are also located to the northwest of Novogrodivka. These are villages that are to the west of Kryty Yar and Krasny Yar and Nikolaevka. So clearly fighting continues for these villages, but the Ukrainians, heavily outnumbered, they've lost control of Novogrodivka. They're apparently continuing to lose ground in Selidovo, further south. The Russians seem to be in the process of sorting out their logistics in that area. Could be that there are still Ukrainian troops cut off in Nivolskoye, in the area, the fields west of Nivolskoye. The Russians steadily, incrementally occupying those fields. But anyway, the Russians likely to control Ukrainsk very soon. The Ukrainian troops who were defending in Ukrainsk are surrounded and cut off, and there's a critical situation for the Ukrainians. In Girnik, there's a very complex game between the Russians and the Ukrainians for control of the various villages in the Pokrovsk area. It's clear that the Russians have a significant advantage in men and material. They're able to attack in multiple directions at the same time. The Ukrainians are straining every nerve to resist the Russians in this area, but it is proving increasingly difficult for them to do so, and they're suffering very heavy losses by trying. Now, yesterday, Redovka gave a very detailed rundown of the situation in Toretsk and spoke about significant Russian advances in Toretsk. The map here is very difficult for me to read, but anyway, in summary, the Russians, according to Redovka, and they do, remember, have people on the ground, that they're not always the most reliable source. Anyway, it does seem as if the Russians have been making significant progress in the Toretsk area as well. And I have heard less over the course of the last 24 hours about the situation in Siversk and the situation in Chasiv Yar, but it does seem as if the Russians continue to make progress in both of these places as well. And as I have discussed they've also now got a small but stable foothold west of the Zherebets River, and they could soon be preparing advances on the town of Kupiansk and towards Liman as well. Probably, as I said, at some point this autumn, the battle to clear this whole area will begin in earnest, and we'll be seeing Russian attacks on Siversk, Liman, and Kupiansk, probably all happening at roughly the same time, all in conjunction with perhaps a final drive by the Russians to clear the remaining Ukrainian troops out of Chasiv Yar. Now, on the question of redeployment of Russian troops from the Donbass front, I said that up to now, the only information I've received about Russian redeployments from the Donbass front involved the two Marine brigades that were sent from Kherson region to Kursk and a force, perhaps a battalion, from the 106th Airborne Guards Division, which was conducting the offensive in Siversk region. Now, I believe that, in fact, the greater part of the 106th Airborne Guards Division has been redeployed to Siversk region, to Kursk region from Siversk, and that might explain why the Russian advance towards Siversk has slowed, though it should be said that Russian artillery and drone attacks remain as relentless as ever, and I get the sense that perhaps mechanized troops are now being introduced into the Siversk area in place of the lightly equipped paratroopers of the 106th Airborne Guards Division. And these heavy mechanized troops with their BMP-3s and their tanks, if they're, of course, unleashed towards Siversk, well, that will start to make a significant difference in terms of the outcome of the war. Anyway, that is my overall rundown of the situation today. Very disturbing, very worrying news coming from the United States. Most alarming that there has been a second assassination attempt on Donald Trump. I've noticed, by the way, that reporting in the British media, and I believe the American media, has held back to some extent from acknowledging that two assassination attempts on the same candidate in a single presidential election cycle are something entirely out of the ordinary. Two serious assassination attempts, I should make clear, though I believe, I'm sure, I'm confident that that is indeed the case. Anyway, as for the rest, Zelensky's victory plan appears to be as fantastic as pretty much everything else that comes out of the Ukrainian government these days. I have to say that I get the growing sense of a government that is desperate and clutching at straws. And I also get the sense that there is no one else in Ukraine that is prepared to look at this problem in a different way. Well, no one else in authority, or who could potentially form any succeeding authority. If we wait for Ukraine to initiate negotiations with the Russians, then we're going to wait forever, because no such negotiations will take place, and the war will definitely end with a military outcome, which will be a Russian victory. And with every day, we see that Russian military victory draws closer, and the time horizon gets shorter, and significantly shorter. We are I think in terms of Ukraine's military prospects, well past the point of no return. Just saying. The only question is how long it will be before the final collapse comes, if the war continues in the way that it does. That shifts the burden onto the Western powers to think of a new strategy. But for the moment, they're not doing so. They're instead debating with each other, reckless, indeed potentially disastrous plans for long-range missile strikes, which most of them concede would not change the outcome of the war or the course of the war. Anyway, one of the reasons why there's been this second assassination attempt of Donald Trump is probably that he has a peace plan. And we've had some tantalizing glimpses of what it might be from his vice presidential partner, J.D. Vance. I've said previously, I think it's a plan which, as it is set out, the Russians would almost certainly reject, and the Ukrainians certainly would, but which the Russians could accept as a basis for discussion. It says an awful lot about the state of things, that the very fact, apparently, of coming up with a peace plan to end a war which is being lost may have sufficed in itself to provoke some unhappy individual into trying to prevent that peace plan from being put into effect by the assassination of Donald Trump, which he has attempted. Anyway, there we are. That's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by checking out our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.